Good morning. Welcome back to AM Joy. Joy is got some very well-deserved time off. I'm Ali Velshi in a weak facsimile, but thank you for sticking with me. Harvey is a tropical storm now, finally, after being a hurricane for a lot longer than most hurricanes last after they've hit land. It's still battering Houston, though. Houston, the storm has showered southeast Texas with over 20 inches of rain already, and there is at least that much more to come. That's the problem. Meteorologists expect catastrophic flooding. Texas Governor Greg Abbott is expected to give updates on the storm a little more than an hour from now. But while Harvey rages on in Texas, the president has been raging on Twitter. Among other things, including the flooding, he's already tweeted about the border wall. Quote, with Mexico being one of the highest crime nations in the world, we must have the wall. Mexico will pay for it through reimbursement / other. We are in the NAFTA, in parentheses, worst trade deal ever, renegotiation process with Mexico and Canada, both being very difficult, may have to terminate, ? Meanwhile, Trump surrogates are still facing questions about the president's values after he failed to convincingly condemn the actions of white supremacists in Charlottesville, Virginia, a failure that was rebuked by a United Nations committee this week. Fox News' Christopher Wallace asked the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson about that this morning.
I don't believe anyone doubts the American people's values or the commitment of the American government or the government's agencies to advancing those values and defending those values.
And the president's values?
And the president speaks for himself, Chris.
Are you separating yourself from that, sir?
I've made my own comments as to our values as well in a speech I gave to the State Department this past week.
Wow. I mean, that might even be a hashtag, wow. Joining me now is Evan Siegfried. He's a Republican strategist. Karine Jean-Pierre of MoveOn.org. Richard Painter, former chief White House ethics lawyer for President George W. Bush, and MSNBC contributor Malcolm Nance. Karine, let's start with you. There was a awkward pause there for a second. Rex Tillerson is a very deliberate man. In 20 years as a business reporter, he is not a guy who talks to even the business press. He is a very deliberate man. Things don't come out of his mouth accidentally. How did you read that?
Yeah, he's also the most senior cabinet secretary in Trump's administration. So him saying those words is remarkable, and it shows just how isolated Donald Trump is. But I have to say this, Ali, words are cheap. And what is the action? There's been so many red lines drawn over the last several months with the firing of Comey, with, if we go back to Khan family, with Access Hollywood, and still there's been no action, nothing from Republicans. And I say this to Rex Tillerson and Cohen and others, why are you still there? If this is such a problem for you, if he doesn't speak for you, why have you not resigned?
Evan, this is an interesting point because a number of the president's so-called globalist or Democrat advisors, as Breitbart calls them, Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and Gary Cohn, the chief economic advisor, have come under a lot of pressure to rebuke the president or to resign. In fact, Mnuchin, 300 of his Yale fellow graduates wrote a letter to him, and he responded with a fairly defensive position about this thing, starting with I don't know why I have to defend the president. Gary Cohn got a lot of ink on Friday for a much more reasoned response about why he thinks it's important to be in the service of the American people and stay in that White House, and that the White House has to do more on these things. But to Karine's point, a lot of people say, why don't you just leave?
Well, I think every cabinet secretary has to take a gut check and say, am I here for the right reasons? We know that Secretary Mattis, General Dunford, McMaster, and John Kelly are there to try and keep the president from breaking the world. They aren't exactly the biggest fans of his, but they have a patriotic sense of duty. Whereas Gary Cohn, he wants to be Fed chair when Janet Yellen's term is up.
Right, and that's not the same as saving the world.
No, that's advancing your own career and an agenda. But I think there are congressional Republicans who are stepping up, but the thing that has troubled me is when Jeff Flake stood up, his approval rating dropped 18 points, and Democrats attacked him for standing up, because to them, standing up is also meaning voting Democratic Party line on issues. And Jeff Flake went out and said it's about morals, not about policy, that I'm standing up with the to the president.
So Richard Painter, to this point, Jeff Flake's argument I thought was very compelling. His op-ed and his book about conservatives or Republicans going back to what values are, distancing themselves from the wrong things, and he very clearly enunciates that Donald Trump is the wrong thing. And Richard Painter, I ask this of you because a lot of people know you to be a critic of this administration, but you have been a Republican for a very long time.
Well, yes, we need to go back to fundamental values of the Republican Party. We're the party of Abraham Lincoln. We are a party that has, for many decades, strongly supported civil rights. There have been arguments in recent decades about affirmative action and other issues where the Republicans differ amongst themselves. But this administration has taken us into new terrain, catering to the lowest elements in our society. We all know, and I have to say, I've been in Republican Party politics for 30 years. When we hear people from the far right, the so-called alt-right, talk about globalists, they're talking about Jews. We know what's going on. There's an attack here on a number of people in the Trump White House, in the Trump administration, who happen to be Jewish. There's also an attack on African Americans going on. That's what we saw down in Charlottesville. None of this has anything to do with traditional Republican values. And the same with the part of Sheriff Joe, who, profiled Hispanics for a search and seizure to try and deport people. This is not the values. These aren't the values of the Republican Party. This has nothing to do with conservatism. And I think that when this is all over and Donald Trump is gone, people such as Senator Flake and Senator McCain and others, they are going to emerge as the heroes of the Republican Party.
But to Evan's point, for the moment, they're taking a beating as a result of it. Malcolm Nance, Chris Whipple, who wrote the book on chiefs of staff, was saying the other day that in the final days of the Nixon administration, the Nixon presidency, while he was drinking heavily and speaking to the oil portraits, his chief of staff decided to stick around to make sure that the president, that he was between the president and the nuclear codes. To Evan's point about McMaster, Kelly, Mattis sticking around so that the president doesn't break the world, do you buy into that?
Yes, I do buy into that. And, I had a talk with Chris Whipple about this a couple of weeks ago. The chief of staff's role is paramount in White Houses to keep the president on track. And what we're seeing right now with General Kelly, he's doing a very good job of keeping the rest of the staff on track. He's starting to weed out the people who should never have been in the White House, especially the Steve Bannon faction. But for the most part, they are going to have to keep an eye on the president. The president has the ultimate authority to use atomic weapons, and the only thing that can stop him is not verifying that he is the president of the United States. Everything else requires that system to operate and to launch a weapon and destroy another country in 35 minutes. So we're going to have to see where the Patriots, amongst those generals, are going to make sure that they keep him in check, especially if he decides to go off the deep end. And at this point, as we heard from former Director of Intelligence Clapper, that's quite possible.
Karine Jean-Pierre, I mean, can you believe that we're having this conversation in 2017? No. I mean, what should Democrats actually want? Because there are a lot of people who, I think since Election Day, a lot of Democrats, a lot of people who didn't like Donald Trump, who were waiting for his impending failure. And as he seems to get closer to bringing that on, there are a lot of people who have to think very carefully about the fact that we don't really want entire impending failure, because if all sorts of people leave the president's side and he gets to surround himself with the Stephen Millers and the Sebastian Gorkas and the Bannons of the world might be a less safe place.
No, I agree with Malcolm. I think when it comes to the foreign policy component of the folks in the White House, yeah, I think it's important for McMaster and others to be there to really protect our country as much as they can. But I think to your question about Democrats, look, I think the majority of Americans disagree with everything that Donald Trump is doing with their policy. We've seen that with the repeal of Obamacare. We've seen that with many other protest out there in the streets. And I think what Democrats need to continue to do is just stand strong and reject all of the failed policies that Donald Trump is trying to push forth. But I think here's the thing. Once again, I'm going to say this. Republicans hold the cards here. They are the ones who have all three branches of power. They are the ones that can stop Donald Trump. And they're not. Their words are nice. He goes off the rails, and the Republicans condemn him as they should, but they have not taken any action. A perfect example is the censure resolution. Here's an opportunity for Republicans to go on the record and say this is not our country, and not just to Americans here, but our allies, our adversaries, to say no, we do not believe the things that Donald Trump says. But they have not. Not one Republican has signed on to the censure resolution. And so this is the problem. They have not taken any action. And what is it going to take?
Richard Painter, let me just ask you to that question, because since the president's comments on Charlottesville, episode A, episode B, and episode 3, and then the discussion from Tennessee Senator Corker, who was a big ally of Donald Trump's, that he may not really understand what the presidency is and may not possess the basic capabilities of being president, some people have started to talk about the replacement of President Trump. Is that a real conversation?
I am sure behind closed doors it is. The question is who's going to be the first to pull the trigger. But if you were to privately poll Republican leaders and ask them would they rather have Mike Pence be president or Donald Trump, I think it's pretty clear what the answer is. I wonder whether you could find more than a handful of senators who would prefer Donald Trump. The question is, are they willing to pull the trigger and stand up to the president and encourage the House to impeach him, have the Senate remove him, and do that quickly before the 2018 elections are a debacle? Because I think that the rate we're going now, the voters are going to turn against just about every senator and member of the House who is not willing to remove the president. This is a very serious situation, and try to appeal to the alt-right Breitbart News, which is a racist publication, and the KKK, the lowest elements of society. This has nothing to do with traditional conservatism. Traditional conservatives read the Dallas Morning News and the Wall Street Journal, not Breitbart. And people like Sebastian Gorka and Bannon, I know they're gone, but there are other alt-right people still in the White House, Stephen Miller and others. They all need to be removed. The president needs to stop kowtowing to the racist factions, which is what happened with the pardon of Sheriff Joe. It's just he's constantly looking for the people at the bottom of the barrel, to try and appeal based on racial divisions, religious divisions. As I say, this attack on globalists is really an attack on Jews. It's a very, very disturbing situation.
Not that I'm asking anyone to go to Breitbart, but if you go to Breitbart and you look and you look at any reference to a Jewish globalist, they actually have little globes next to their name on the actual website. That's the little trick that Breitbart uses for Jewish globalists. And to Richard Painter's point, the Republican Party has for a very long time been home to some very influential Jews in America, and has been a place that has respected the intellectual contribution and political contribution that Jews have made. So Breitbart is right out of sync with that particular approach. Okay, thanks to all of you, Evan Siegfried, Karine Jean-Pierre, Richard Painter, and Malcolm Nance. Some of you are sticking around. This show's new to me. It's hard to keep track, but I'm sure I'm going to see some of you again. I certainly am around for the next 47 minutes. Coming up next, Joe Arpaio's lawyer joins us live on AM Joy if he's stuck around after listening to that conversation. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.